Imagine you are handed a blank map, a ruler, a pencil, and 30 minutes. Now imagine that the lines you draw in those 30 minutes will start wars that still haven't ended, will force 60 million people to live in countries they didn't choose, under governments they didn't want, with enemies manufactured for them overnight. Now imagine that you know almost nothing about the people living on that map. You have never been there. You don't speak their language. You don't understand their history, their rivalries, their sacred cities, their tribal blood feuds stretching back 400 years. And then you draw the lines anyway. This actually happened in 1916 in a room in London by two men with a ruler and a color pencil set, and we are still living in the world they drew. But here's what your history teacher never told you. The two men who did this weren't generals. They weren't heads of state. One was a minor diplomat who had spent exactly 4 days in the region he was dividing, and the other one didn't even want the job. To understand what they destroyed, you first need to understand what existed before they touched it. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire was 600 years old. That is not a metaphor for something decrepit and ready to fall. 6 centuries is 6 centuries. The Roman Empire lasted roughly that long. The British Empire at its height would manage less than half of it. The Ottomans had built something genuinely unusual, a vast multi-ethnic, multi-religious administrative system stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, from North Africa to the borders of Persia. Inside it lived Sunni Arabs, Shia Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, Druze, Alawites, and dozens of smaller communities, each operating under a system the Ottomans called the millet. Each community largely governed its own religious law, its own courts, its own internal affairs. The empire above them collected taxes and maintained order. Was it just? By modern standards, no. Minorities faced discrimination. Violence erupted periodically. And in the final years of the empire, beginning around 1915, the Ottoman state would commit atrocities against the Armenian population that historians broadly classify as genocide. But for all its brutality and its decline, it was a functioning system. One that had managed for centuries to prevent any single identity from obliterating all the others. Then in late October 1914, the Ottoman government made its decision and entered the First World War on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. It shelled Russian ports, and it effectively signed its own death warrant. Within weeks of that declaration, in the corridors of Whitehall and the Quai d'Orsay, two empires had begun drawing up plans for what would come after, not whether the Ottoman Empire would be dismembered, how, and by whom. His name was Mark Sykes. He was 36 years old, the son of a wealthy Yorkshire baronet, educated at Cambridge, elected to Parliament, charming in the way that men who have never faced serious consequences sometimes are. He was witty at dinner parties and vivid in his memoranda, and absolutely convinced that he understood the Arab world better than almost any man alive. The evidence suggests otherwise. Sykes had traveled through the Ottoman Empire several times as a young aristocrat. He had published a book of observations in the breezy, condescending tone common to Edwardian travel writing. He had met tribal leaders and Ottoman officials and come away with impressions that were, by his own later admission, sometimes wildly wrong. His colleagues in the Foreign Office were not blind to his limitations. Sir Arthur Nicholson, the permanent Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, wrote privately that Sykes had the enthusiasm of a brilliant undergraduate and the tendency to mistake vivid impressions for deep knowledge. That is not a compliment. That is a warning that someone failed to heed. In a letter to a friend written in 1918, Sykes himself reflected, "I have committed great errors in my public life based on insufficient knowledge. I drew up schemes with the confidence of youth and the ignorance of one who has read much but understood little." And yet, in the autumn of 1915, it was Mark Sykes who the British government sent to negotiate the future of the Middle East. Not T.E. Lawrence, who actually spoke Arabic and had lived among the tribes. Not Gertrude Bell, whose knowledge of the region was encyclopedic and would later be called upon to draw the borders of Iraq. Mark Sykes, the enthusiastic amateur, was given the pen. The man France sent to meet him was different in almost every way, and what passed between them over the following weeks would be binding for a century. But before we get to that room, we need to understand something. The Arabs who were about to be divided had already been promised something else entirely, and that promise had been made in writing. In July 1915, a man named Hussein bin Ali, the Grand Sharif of Mecca, the custodian of Islam's holiest cities, sat down to write a letter to Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. Hussein controlled the Hejaz. He had authority, religious legitimacy, and, critically, access to tens of thousands of Arab fighters who could revolt against the Ottoman Empire from within. Britain desperately wanted that revolt. A second front in Arabia would stretch Ottoman resources and threaten the empire's southern flank. Hussein wanted something in return. He wanted a guarantee. He wanted to know that if his people rose up and bled for Britain, there would be an independent Arab state on the other side of the war, a unified Arab homeland spanning most of what is now Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and the Arabian Peninsula. McMahon wrote back, "Between July 1915 and March 1916, the two men exchanged 10 letters that would become one of the most disputed documents in modern diplomatic history." McMahon's letter of October 24th, 1915 is the crucial one. It promised British support for Arab independence in most of the region, with some geographic exclusions, whose exact meaning is still debated by historians. Hussein accepted. He called the Great Arab Revolt. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, rode into battle. Arab fighters harassed Ottoman supply lines, sabotaged railways, and helped British forces advance through the region. Their contribution was real and significant. T.E. Lawrence, who fought alongside them, wrote later that the Arab forces tied down tens of thousands of Ottoman troops who would otherwise have fought the British on other fronts. They fought, they died, they believed the promise, and at the exact same moment they were bleeding for it, the promise was being canceled in that room with that pencil. François Georges-Picot was everything Sykes was not. 60 years old, a career diplomat. Cold, meticulous, professionally unemotional. He had served in Beirut. He spoke the languages. He knew exactly what France wanted, and he had been sent to get it. Control of the Syrian coast, Lebanon, and a large slice of the Arab interior. The legacy of French cultural and religious influence in the Levant, which stretched back to the Crusades, was not something Paris was prepared to bargain away. The two men met in a series of sessions in late 1915. Their negotiation was not complicated. It was a straight territorial division between two empires, conducted in the language of polite European diplomacy, with a map as the only witness. Sykes later described how he drew the boundary in a letter. The line ran, as he put it, from the letter E in Acre on the Mediterranean coast to the last letter K in Kirkuk in the north of what is now Iraq. He meant he was using the place names printed on the map itself as his anchor points. Not rivers, not mountain ranges, not the boundaries of existing communities or tribal territories. The typography on a printed map. Everything north of that line fell into the French sphere, everything south into the British. A separate zone around Jerusalem was designated international, given the city's significance to three world religions. The oil-rich territories of what would become Iraq were placed in the British zone, though this was managed through deliberately ambiguous language. The agreement was formalized on May 16, 1916. It was immediately stamped secret. It was not shown to any Arab leader. It was not shown to Hussein of Mecca, whose soldiers were at that very moment fighting and dying on the basis of the promises in the McMahon letters. The Arab revolt continued. The soldiers kept writing. Buried in a Foreign Office file marked confidential was the document that had already decided their fate. But secrets of this magnitude do not keep forever, and the way this particular secret was revealed would shake the entire architecture of the war and humiliate Britain in front of every Arab ally it had. Because it was not a journalist who found it. It was not a whistleblower. It was the Bolsheviks, and they published it deliberately. By November 1917, there were 3 overlapping promises attached to the same piece of land, and Britain was the author of all 3. The first was the McMahon Correspondence, an independent Arab state. The second was Sykes-Picot, a British and French colonial division. And then, on November 2nd, 1917, came the third. Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, wrote a letter to Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The letter stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was one paragraph. It would become one of the most consequential paragraphs in the 20th century. A British Foreign Office internal memo written in October 1917 acknowledged that senior officials privately recognized the Balfour Declaration could not be straightforwardly reconciled with the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. The memo recommended proceeding and dealing with contradictions as they arise. They wrote that, they knew, and they proceeded anyway. 3 weeks after the Balfour Declaration, on November 23, 1917, the Bolsheviks, who had just seized power in Russia in the October Revolution, did something that British diplomats had dreaded. They opened the Tsar's diplomatic archives, found the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and published it, in full, in the Russian newspaper Izvestia and Pravda, as an act of deliberate political warfare against the Western Allies. The Arab leaders read it in the newspaper. Faisal, Hussein's son, who was at that moment moment in the field commanding the Arab revolt, read about the agreement that had already divided the territory he was fighting for. He sent word to T.E. Lawrence demanding an explanation. Lawrence, who had known about the agreement, had no adequate answer. They had been fighting for a promise that had already been sold twice over, and now the whole world knew. The war ended in November 1918. The Ottoman Empire was gone, and in the months and years that followed, at Versailles, at San Remo, in the League of Nations mandate system, the lines drawn by Sykes and Picot became, with modifications, the actual borders of the modern Middle East. Syria and Lebanon became French mandates. Lebanon was carved out of Greater Syria specifically to create a Christian-majority territory where France could maintain political influence. Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan became British mandates. These were not independent states. They were colonial territories with new names. The Kurdish people, who numbered in the millions and occupied contiguous territory in the mountains of what is now southern Turkey, northern Syria, northern Iraq, and northwestern Iran, found themselves divided between 4 different countries, none of which had any interest in protecting their identity. The Kurdish question, whether there should be an independent Kurdistan, remains one of the defining geopolitical problems of the region today. It was created in those rooms, at those conferences, by men who were dividing territory like a card game. Iraq was perhaps the most brutally artificial construction. 3 distinct Ottoman provinces, Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, Basra in the south, were combined into a single British mandate. They contained communities that had never shared a government, a Kurdish north, a Sunni Arab center, and a Shia Arab south. The British governed them by imposing a Hashemite king, Faisal, the same Faisal who had led the Arab revolt, partly as compensation for the throne in Syria that the French had just denied him. Gertrude Bell, one of the architects of the Iraqi state, wrote a letter to her father in 1920 following the Iraqi revolt against British rule. She wrote, "We have had a revolution and we shall have more. I have said it before and I say it again. We are living on a volcano." Bell knew what she had built, a volcano, which erupted in 1941 and 1958 and 1963 and 1979 and 1991 and 2003 and again in 2014 when a militant group calling itself the Islamic State declared its caliphate and made a point of publicly destroying the border markers between Iraq and Syria, filming it and captioning the footage with a single phrase, the end of Sykes-Picot. That phrase resonated across the Arab world in a way that surprised many Western commentators who had never heard of the agreement. The people living inside those borders had not forgotten. They had been living inside the wound for 90 years. Mark Sykes died on February 16, 1919 in the Hotel Lati in Paris. He was 39 years old. The cause was influenza, the same pandemic that was killing tens of millions across the world that year. He died in the middle of the Paris Peace Conference, the conference that was, in those very weeks, finalizing the borders he had helped to sketch. He never saw what those borders became, but in his final months, something had shifted in his thinking. A series of private letters show a man quietly reckoning with what he had set in motion. He wrote about the Arabs who had been promised independence and given mandates instead. He used a word that appears in more than one letter. He wrote that the settlement was built on a foundation of broken faith. He died before the mandate system was formally established, before the revolts, before the wars, before the refugee camps. He died in a hotel room in Paris with the map still being redrawn in the building across the street. There is something almost unbearably ironic about that. The man who drew the line died at the exact moment the consequences began to arrive. He never had to live in what he had built, but 100 years later, millions of people still do. Mark Sykes spent 4 days in the region he divided. He drew his line from the letter E to the letter K in a set of words on a map. He died at 39 before the consequences arrived, and his name is taught, if it is taught at all, as a footnote in a chapter about World War I diplomacy. But in the villages of southern Iraq, in the refugee camps of northern Syria, in the border towns where the Kurds were split between 4 countries that had no interest in them, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, which was carved out of Syria, specifically to give France a Christian-majority client state on the Mediterranean coast. A decision that produced a civil war lasting 15 years and a political system so paralyzed it cannot elect a president. In all of those places, his line is not a footnote. It is the air people breathe. And the lesson here is not simply that colonialism was bad. That is too easy. The lesson is something darker and more specific. It is that the people with the power to draw lines on maps, in laws, in international agreements almost never live inside those lines. They go home. They file the papers. They move on to the next problem. The people who don't get to go home are the ones the lines were drawn around. The lines that divide our world were not drawn by gods. They were carved into parchment by men inside closed rooms. rooms, driven by ambition, ignorance, and deadline pressure, and we are still cleaning up what they spilled.